David O Farrell, a hunting guide, had to think quickly on his feet and make a near-impossible shot to save the life of his hunter. It was a life-or-death situation, and David's extensive experience and steady hand were put to the test in the most terrifying of circumstances. It was September 2022, and David was guiding Richard, an archery hunter from Louisiana, through the Yukon. The incredible area of wilderness, which is the smallest and westernmost of Canada's 3 territories, offers hunters the chance to tag moose, caribou, wood bison, sheep, goats, grizzly bears, black bears, wolves, wolverines, and coyotes. The pair flew into a small, remote lake. They skimmed the water before motoring to shore and setting up camp. It was a beautiful location, so picturesque but characteristic of the Yukon. Richard was eager to harvest a variety of species, including a grizzly bear. So David had his work cut out for him. But his hunting trip didn't quite pan out as he had hoped. On the first morning of their hunt, they hiked up a steep ridge that was towering above the camp. David knew the area, and he knew that the ridge would be an excellent glassing spot to locate potential animals for Richard. He wasn't wrong. After the uphill slog, they caught their breaths and scouted the surrounding scenery. On the opposite side of the mountain, there were 6 doll rams, one of which had large, heavy horns. David knew that Richard would have his eye on that one. Then, far below them in the valley, there was a small herd of caribou nibbling the herbs and shrubs peacefully. These 2 finds straight away were bound to earn David some bonus points with his paying client. But things were about to take a turn for the worse. As the 2 crouched down watching the rams on the mountainside, Richard began to get restless. David didn't want to take his eyes off the prime ram. He was the perfect target for Richard, but he wanted to wait until they stopped grazing and bedded down. They were slowly and gradually making their way towards a broken ridge. It wouldn't be long before they lay down on the ground and Richard and David would be able to stalk closer, giving Richard the opportunity to make a relatively easy shot. But after an hour of watching the small flock, Richard asked if he could scout further along the ridge they were on. David agreed, but insisted that he stayed within shouting distance. That was a hunting guide's #1 rule. It is also the rule of the Yukon territory, and for good reason. As Richard wandered off, David kept his scope focused on the ram. The first few were begging to settle on the ground, and it wouldn't be long before the entire flock would be lying down. Soon he would fetch Richard, and they would try to get as close as possible. But just as he was thinking about going to get the hunter, he heard him call his name. There was something off in the sound of Richard's voice. It immediately sent a shiver down David's spine. Something was wrong. He stood up and turned around. David didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle and followed the ridge along in the direction Richard had left. There was something urgent in the hunter's voice. It had an element of fear in it. When he finally came across Richard, he realized why he had lost sight of him. The path dipped slightly, and David was standing in that dip, with an enormous grizzly bear on its hind legs towering above him. David froze. In the milliseconds that followed, David weighed up his options. The bear was just 3 feet from Richard. David couldn't understand how a bear that large had managed to get so close to Richard. He couldn't tell from where he was whether it was a boar or a sow. If it was a sow, were there cubs or even yearlings in tow? If there were, then where were they, as they can also be a big problem? The next question flying through his head at that moment was what to do about it. David was a good shot, but Richard was in the worst possible position. He was standing directly in front of the bear, between the beast and David. It meant that David had, at best, 6 inches to the hunter's right to make a shot. If David moved when he squeezed the trigger, then it would be game over. If he only maimed the bear, then it would also be game over. All too often, David had heard stories of injured bears who had been struck by 1, 2, 3 bullets before becoming enraged and taking it out on the nearest thing. In this case, that thing would have been Richard. Although all these thoughts raced through David's head, and he contemplated each one, they'd only cost him a second or two to think about. And now he had to make one of the biggest decisions of his life, whether to try to make the shot or not. The bear was acting predatorily. Any moment now it was going to bring itself down on Richard, and he would feel the full force of one of nature's most formidable predators. He had nothing to defend himself with. He clutched only a pair of binoculars in his hands. He couldn't run, and he couldn't fight. David had to do it for him. And this whole time, Richard didn't move a muscle. He stayed perfectly still, which David couldn't quite believe as he raised the rifle scope to his eye. He stared down it and centered the red dot of his Aimpoint Micro H1 right in the middle of the bear's chest. Then he squeezed the trigger. As soon as the bang rang out all around them, the bear dropped to the ground. It was instant. Even as the shot cracked through the air, Richard still didn't move. David chambered another round just in case and ran over to him. Richard was standing just staring at the enormous, motionless bear. "You just saved my life," he said without looking up at David. After catching their breaths, David asked him exactly what had happened. They sat down and Richard explained everything. He had walked along the ridge to glass for animals in the valley below. He peered through his binoculars, but as he did so, something caught his attention in his peripheral vision. It was the bear, just 30 yards away. He hadn't seen it coming because the ridge dropped away steeply, concealing part of the trail. The bear had walked right into him. He yelled out for David, hoping the sound of his voice would scare the bear away. But it didn't. It just kept coming. That's when he knew he was in serious trouble. By the time he called for David a second time, yelling for him to bring a gun, the bear was just 3 feet away. It clacked its jaws, popping its teeth, an aggressive sign that says, "Back off." But Richard resisted the urge to run. His heart was thundering in his chest, adrenaline pumping through him. Every muscle fiber twitched as the fight-or-flight response geared up for action. Everything was telling him to get out of there, to get as far away as possible from that bear. But he knew he wouldn't get far before it caught up to him, and he just hoped that David would come to his rescue in time. But was hugely relieved when the rifle fired and the bear dropped to the ground right before his eyes. David attributed his excellent shot to the aim point he was using. Without that red dot, it wouldn't have been clear where the bullet would strike the animal, and it would have been a whole lot harder to make that shot safely with Richard in the way. That day, Landon, his father Don, and his cousin Chris Harper joined family friend John Quintrell for a bow hunting trip in Wyoming's Upper Green River area. Only Landon and John had elk tags. The 2 others were just along for the adventure. And what an adventure it turned out to be! They rode into the wilderness on an off-road UTV. Then, whilst Don and Chris hiked further into the woodland on a scouting mission, Landon and John headed for a hillside with a great position for spotting elk coming into the clearing below. The 2 hunters set themselves up 300 yards apart. Landon nestled up against a large boulder. It was well hidden with some deadwood scattered on the ground. Less than 2 minutes later, he heard the distinctive rustling of leaves coming from one side. He couldn't believe his luck. He hadn't even taken his bow off his back, and now an elk was going to walk right past him. He had definitely chosen a prime spot, or so he thought. He strained his neck to look around the boulder and caught a glimpse of brown. It was going to be a large elk. He could hear its heavy footsteps on the fallen leaves and the cracking of twigs. He pulled his bow and arrows out ready and held his breath. But to his complete disbelief, it wasn't an elk. Instead, it was a grizzly bear. And she wasn't alone. Scuttling along beside her were 2 cubs. He could see them clearly now. The distinctive hump on the mother's back. The enormous head swaying slightly with each footstep. Landon was in the worst position imaginable. He was tight against the boulder with nowhere to go. He pressed himself as hard as he could against the stone and dared not breathe. He pulled out his pistol in case they came for him. But Landon hoped it wouldn't come to that. He prayed that they would continue on down the hill and not notice him. Then, to his horror, instead of walking down the hill away from his position, the bears turned upwards. They followed a little path through the trees, a path that led directly to the boulder where Landon was hiding. He knew something bad was about to happen, and he readied himself. Seconds later, he saw all three bears stop on the spot and lift their noses skywards. They had caught his scent. Then Landon watched in terror as the mother turned instantly and looked directly at him. He had been spotted. He was in for it now. She was 12 yards away, and she had no mercy. She thundered towards Landon, and he barely had time to squeeze the trigger on his pistol. She covered the distance in a single second, an explosion of raw power torpedoing at Landon. He fired his Glock 10mm 3 or 4 times as she charged at him, her mouth agape, her eyes fixed on his. Her protective instincts were coursing through her body, and she saw Landon as a threat to her offspring. The cracks of the shots rang out and the cubs scampered away, never to be seen again. But the gun didn't stop the mother. She was struck once or twice, but her immense size and power kept her going. Landon heard her huff as she came for him, the sound of a steam train charging down. Then came the inevitable. She grabbed Landon's left thigh and bit down. The adrenaline fueling Landon's body concealed the pain, but Landon could feel the pressure of the bite. She was ferocious as she shook her enormous head from side to side, shaking Landon like a rag doll. Landon had heard of attacks like this before. He had witnessed firsthand the power of a grizzly when one charged and knocked him over on a previous hunting trip. But he was overwhelmed with the raw power of this female. He couldn't imagine anything stronger or more fearful on the planet. She just unleashed hell on him, and he was entirely at her mercy. He was still squeezing the trigger of his pistol, over and over again, but in the heat of the moment he paused for a second and realized that the semi-automatic was no longer firing. To his disbelief, it was jammed. Of all the moments for a gun to jam, it chose this one. That could have cost him his life. He could have lain down his weapon and given up then and there, but he kept fighting. Clearing a jammed pistol was often challenging at the best of times, but with a 600-pound bear biting down on you and tossing you around, it was even harder to do. But Landon knew that it was a matter between life and death. He knew that the pistol was all he had to protect himself, and that the grizzly wasn't letting go. Miraculously, he managed to unjam the gun, and he brought it over and above the bear's head. He fired 3 shots, and the bear immediately let go and tumbled backwards. It was dead. Landon rushed down the hill, hobbling and screaming for John, Don, and Chris. All of a sudden, his senses returned. The adrenaline was wearing off, and he began to comprehend the gravity of the situation. He had come within an inch of losing his life. When he looked down at the pistol in his hand, it had jammed once more. If it had jammed again before delivering the fatal shot, then in all likelihood the bear would have won the fight. An incredible smell filled his nostrils. It was coming from the bear. It smelt of rotten meat, damp and garbage. The smell was overpowering. Landon's hand shook by his side. His leg was oozing blood from the open wound in the thigh. He felt lightheaded and dizzy. The world went blurry, and he slumped down against a tree, dazed by the near-death experience he'd just had. John had overheard his cries for help and had come running. The multiple shots from the pistol had rung out and alerted Don and Chris to the situation, and they rushed to the scene as quickly as they could. They were 3/4 of a mile away and scrambled over fallen trees, rocks, and boulders to get to the others. When John arrived, he found Landon slouched against the tree. He could tell he was in a bad way. Just a few yards away was the bear. There was no sign of the cubs anywhere. When the others made it to their location, John rushed off to fetch the UTV and bring it closer. Landon had to make an agonizing 1.5-mile hike back to the vehicle. He was now in excruciating agony and propped himself up with a stick and help from his father and cousin. It was slow going, but they eventually made it to the vehicle and the others rushed him to Pinedale Clinic. Landon was lucky that the bear hadn't severed any arteries. The doctors stitched him up, but as he was recovering in the clinic, game wardens came to question him over the dead bear. It is illegal to kill bears in the lower 48 states, except in self-defense. It is standard protocol for game wardens to investigate the killing of any brown bear, and Landon had to take the wardens out to the site of the shooting so that they could understand exactly what happened. Landon was sad about shooting the bear. He did not want to pull the trigger, especially not on a mother with cubs, but he knew that in that moment it was either him or her. He has always and always will admire grizzlies. They are a part of the great outdoors that he loves so much. He doubts that bear spray would have stopped the charge. It all happened so quickly, and it felt as thought the bear would stop at nothing to protect her young. Landon said that he thinks bringing back the hunting of grizzlies in Wyoming might save human lives by making them more fearful, but in his words, "I do not want the grizzlies to go away. They are a beautiful animal, and they should be free to roam this earth that God gave us." In mid-October 2018, dark clouds loomed over Michalchuk's property in Bella Coola, British Columbia. He and his wife had just returned from a week-long trip, eager to reunite with their children and share stories of their travels. However, their homecoming came with unsettling news. During their absence, Michalchuk's in-laws, who had been caring for the children, reported a growing problem. Grizzly bears had moved into the yard. A mother bear and her 3 cubs had claimed the property as their own, causing increasing destruction. Drawn by the fruit trees, they would climb the branches, feast on the ripened fruit, dig through the earth in search of roots, and leave their droppings scattered across the yard. What had started as occasional visits had quickly turned into a dangerous situation. Spending time outdoors was becoming a challenge. The children were afraid, and despite their best efforts, Michalchuk's in-laws had been unable to drive the bears away. They had tried making loud noises, shaking a bucket filled with nuts and bolts, but the grizzlies remained unfazed. These bears weren't just passing through, they were confident, territorial, and seemed to regard Michalchuk's family as intruders rather than the rightful occupants of the land. If they returned, something had to be done. Grizzly bears are among nature's most formidable predators. Powerful, fast, and incredibly tough. As one of the largest subspecies of brown bear, they are both resilient and fiercely protective of their young. While many people might find the idea of living in such close proximity to these animals unthinkable, in Bella Coola, British Columbia, grizzlies are a fact of life. The region is well known for frequent human-bear interactions. With its dense forests and abundant rivers, Bella Coola is a natural paradise for both people and wildlife. Tourists flock to the area for bear-watching tours and safaris, drawn by the opportunity to see these magnificent creatures up close. But some argue that this increased human presence has made the bears more brazen, less fearful of people than they should be. And as a result, encounters with aggressive grizzlies have become more common. Lawrence Michalchuk knew he couldn't allow this situation to escalate. A mother grizzly and her 3 cubs had essentially claimed his yard, and he feared a disaster was looming. His children were young, and his daughter was especially terrified, understandably so. She had already suffered a traumatic bear attack in the past, leaving her with a severe arm injury. Michalchuk couldn't shake the thought of history repeating itself. If a fully grown adult was no match for an enraged grizzly, what chance would a child have? At 54 years old, Lawrence Michalchuk knew his duty as a father and husband. He had to protect his family. If the bears returned, he wasn't going to let them take over his property again. As expected, the following morning, the grizzlies emerged once more. There was no denying their beauty, the way they moved, their sheer presence. But admiration didn't change the fact that they posed a threat. Michalchuk didn't want to harm them, but he needed to make them understand that this was not their home. Determined, he grabbed his shotgun, loaded with birdshot, and stepped outside. His wife and children remained inside, watching nervously from a window. His wife, sensing the weight of the moment, decided to film everything. Michalchuk wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't trying to frighten his children either. He simply wanted to send a clear message to the bears. Standing beneath his front deck, his loyal dog by his side, he took a deep breath and fired his first shot into the air. The loud blast echoed through the yard. Ideally, that would be enough. The bears would get startled and run off. But things didn't go as planned. Rather than retreating, the mother grizzly locked eyes with him. She wasn't leaving without a challenge. In an instant, she charged straight at him. Panic surged through Michalchuk. Without hesitation, he turned and bolted for the house, barely making it inside. His heart pounded as he watched from the window. Eventually, the bear and her cubs seemed to lose interest and began moving away. Relief washed over him. Maybe they had finally understood. They weren't welcome here. Maybe this time, they were truly leaving for good. Still, he wanted to be sure. With the bears now at a distance, he decided to give them one final push. Once again, he stepped outside, shotgun at the ready. Another shot rang out into the air, meant to reinforce the warning. That turned out to be a mistake. The mother bear stopped in her tracks. Michalchuk shouted, hoping to scare her off once and for all. Another bad move. In an instant, the grizzly's ears flattened, her head pulled back, and her mouth opened. The sun glinted off them as she let out a deep, guttural roar. And then, she charged. This wasn't just a warning. This was a full-on attack. The mother grizzly was furious. She wasn't just defending her territory. She was protecting her young, just as fiercely as Michalchuk was trying to protect his own. This is bad. Really bad, Michalchuk thought, panic creeping in. I don't think I'm going to make it back to the house. But he had no choice. He had to try. His children were inside. He couldn't let this be the end. Then disaster nearly struck. His right shoe slipped off. For a split second, he stumbled, nearly losing his balance. He waited until the grizzly crossed the driveway. Then, in a split-second decision, he raised his shotgun, took aim at her right leg, and pulled the trigger. The shot connected. The bear collapsed onto the ground, stunned. Michalchuk didn't waste a single second. He turned and sprinted for his life, knowing he had only moments before the bear recovered. And he was right. Within seconds, the grizzly was back on her feet, her rage undiminished. She resumed the chase, her massive frame tearing across the yard. But by then, Michalchuk had already reached the door. He lunged inside, slamming it shut behind him. His chest heaved, his hands shook, but he was alive. From the safety of their home, the family watched as the mother bear finally turned away, gathering her cubs. Without another glance back, the four animals disappeared into the wilderness. Later, Michalchuk reported the incident to BC conservation officers. His wife, still shaken from the ordeal, decided to upload the footage to YouTube. Along with the video, Michalchuk shared his side of the story, unaware of the firestorm of controversy that was about to ignite. There was no blood, no fur left behind, and I know she'll be sore, but at least now she'll think twice before approaching humans, Michalchuk explained. I spoke with the local conservation officers, showed them the footage, and they assured me I was fully justified in protecting myself and my family. Honestly, I'm just grateful it was me out there and not my kids. However, once the video went public, it triggered a storm of backlash. Critics condemned his decision to fire at the bear, accusing him of unnecessary aggression. Michalchuk stood by his actions, insisting that he never intended to seriously harm the animal, hence his choice to use birdshot. I didn't want to blind her by aiming for the face, so I targeted her right side instead, hoping to trip her up just long enough for me to escape, he explained. That bear wasn't going to leave, he added. In the end, maybe it all worked out for the best, because she's still alive, and so am I. Todd Orr was scouting for elk for the upcoming season in Montana's Madison Valley. He had just 3 days before the season opened and wanted to get a head start on the prime location of any elk in the area. He began his scouting mission before dawn. In the darkness of fall, the air was crisp. Not wanting to startle any bears every 30 seconds or so, he hollered into the blackness of the forest. Only his footsteps sounded on the ground. It was a peaceful time to be out and about. But after 3 miles of hiking, something else was waiting for him in the clearing. Just ahead of him, at a fork in the trail, there was a grizzly sow and her 2 cubs. The second Todd saw her, she turned and saw him. Their eyes locked and Todd froze. A second later, the grizzly ran away along the western trail, and Todd watched as they disappeared from sight over a ridge. He waited for a minute to make sure they were gone before continuing along the eastern trail in the opposite direction from the bears. Todd had only made it a few yards along the trail when he heard a rustling over his left shoulder. It was the bear. She was back. But worse still, she was thundering towards him. She tore down from the ridge 40 yards away. Her eyes were locked onto Todd's. He couldn't believe the speed of the thing. She covered the distance in mere seconds. Instantly, Todd pulled his canister of pepper spray from its holster, yanked out the safety ring, and released the spray at the bear. But it did nothing to stop her. She was in a full charge and rampaged through the cloud of spray without flinching. Todd threw himself on the ground. He wrapped his arms around the back of his neck and pressed his face into the dirt, hoping and half expecting the bear to gallop past him. But she didn't. She towered over him and bit down on his arm, shoulder, and back. The adrenaline was masking the pain, but he could feel the pressure of every bite. But as quickly as she had arrived, she disappeared. Todd let out a breath and sat up. He looked around nervously, scanning the undergrowth for any sign of the bear. When he was satisfied that she had gone back to her cubs, he got to his feet and checked himself over. The damage wasn't life-threatening. He had deep gauges and cuts, but it was clear that he would survive this if he could just get back to his truck without further incident. Todd picked up his cap and half-empty can of bear spray and immediately headed back to his vehicle. It was a relief to be moving away from the bear, and he walked as quickly as he could to put as much distance between them. This would be one hell of a story to tell him mates back home, if he made it back. All of a sudden, there came another crashing sound. Todd wheeled around and couldn't believe his eyes. It was the bear again. She was charging towards him along the trail. She had either followed him or, unfortunately, chose that moment to step down onto the same path. Todd didn't have time to release his pepper spray nor unleash his sidearm. She was upon him before he even had time to think. Just like before, Todd flung himself to the ground. He didn't know if he could survive a second attack. He was just counting his blessings from the first one and thanking the Lord for protecting him. He didn't know if he could go through it all again. Todd tucked himself up into a ball, trying to protect his neck, face, and vitals. He clasped his hands together, interlocking his fingers behind his neck. He squeezed his eyes shut and braced himself for what was coming. The bear leapt on him, her full weight pressing down on him. Then she began biting him all over again. Todd couldn't believe this was happening for a second time, but this time the attack seemed far more ferocious. The bear was being more aggressive, more powerful with her bites. And then came a loud crunch. She had bitten down to the bone on Todd's left arm, and his hand went limp. Todd let out a gasp of pain, which seemed to send the bear into a frenzy. He knew now that he had to remain completely motionless and silent. He didn't want to provoke her further. So he lay there and endured what she gave him. She would pick him up, a foot or two off the ground in her vice-like jaws, and then drop him repeatedly. Todd thought that the bear must stop soon. She must need to go and check on her cubs and leave him alone. Surely. He knew that with every bite he was just inches away from death. All it would take would be one bite on an artery, and he would bleed out there on the trail. After what seemed like an eternity, the bear stopped biting him. Todd couldn't make out what she was doing as he was pressed the ground. Her two front paws were pushing heavily down on his lower back, stopping him from moving. He could now smell her stench. It was an overpowering, pungent aroma. Blood trickled into Todd's eyes, and the trees and woodland turned into a nightmarish blur. Then, the bear stepped off Todd. He resisted the urge to take in a deep breath, to inflate his lungs after being compressed under hundreds of pounds of weight. Instead, he didn't move. He knew he definitely wouldn't survive a third attack. So, he moved his head very slowly, trying to see around him. Then, before getting up or looking the other way, he slowly moved his right arm from behind his neck and slipped it under his chest, feeling for his gun which was holstered there. But there was no holster and no gun. Where had it gone? Todd couldn't tell. Very gradually, he lifted his head off the ground and looked around him. He expected the bear to pounce on top of him again, but to his immense relief, he didn't see her. Still lying on the ground, straining his neck, he could see his gun lying on the ground a few yards away. His holster lay next to it, torn and shredded. Quickly, he dived for the gun and flicked back the hammer, pointing it all around him. But the bear still wasn't there. He picked up his hat, bear spray, and holster and began making his way to his vehicle once more. This time, he walked even quicker than before. He was terrified the sow would come after him again. There was no phone signal in the area, and there was no one else about. He was on his own. He tried to jog along the trail, but the pounding motion was too painful for his battered and torn arm that hung limp from his body. Besides, he didn't want to increase his heart rate too much for fear of losing too much blood. He paused only to assess his injuries. It was a grueling 45-minute hike back to the trailhead where his vehicle was waiting for him. He rushed up to it, grabbed a jacket to put onto the driver's seat to stop the blood from staining, and climbed in. When he slammed the door shut behind him, he finally felt safe. There was one other car in the parking lot. Todd hoped that whoever it belonged to wouldn't run into the same bear. It was only 8 a.m., and he contemplated leaving a note at the trailhead to warn others. But he struggled to find a piece of paper in his truck, and with blood pouring down his arms and hands, it most likely would have been illegible anyway. Inside his truck, he took a few deep breaths before documenting his injuries on his phone. Then he turned the key in the ignition and began the 30-minute drive to hospital. With still no phone signal, Todd pulled into a driveway where a local was checking his mail. He asked him to call the hospital to let them know that he was on his way and needed help. The man offered to give him a lift himself, but Todd knew he'd get there quicker if he just kept on the road. He didn't feel faint or as though he was going to pass out, so he knew he could make it on his own. When his phone finally pinged back into life, Todd called his girlfriend to let her know what had happened. Then he dialed 911 to explain the situation he was in and where he was headed. To his immense relief, when he arrived at the emergency department in Ennis, staff were waiting for him. He was ushered into surgery. It took 8 hours to repair his ripped and torn body. He received multiple stitches for the deep gashes and puncture wounds on his arms, shoulders, and back. His ulna was chipped and 2 tendons had been ripped from the muscle in his left forearm. That required more surgery to reattach those and try to repair the nerve damage too. The 5-inch gash along the side of his head above his ear was stitched back together but left a nasty scar. A constant reminder of the day he survived not 1, but 2 bear attacks. It seems in some states that the wild pig populations are getting out of control, but few realize just how brutal and dangerous these animals can be. They aren't your typical farmyard piglet. Some weigh hundreds of pounds, possess razor-sharp tusks, and can run like the wind. Not only can they devour acres of cropland in a single night, but they can be lethal to humans. On January 13, 2022, 70-year-old Monte Sullivan was waiting patiently up a ladder stand on family land in northeast Mississippi's Clay County. He had with him his trusty .270 Weatherby rifle. He was looking for big buck, something he could be proud of. But as the hours ticked by, only a handful of youngsters trotted by the stand and the sun began to set. Monte knew it was time to head home. Monte followed the edge of the field towards his pickup truck. But as he walked across a neighbor's food plot, he spotted some shadows 75 yards away. He knew straight away what they were. They were a family of 4 wild pigs. They were rooting in the rye and clover, snouts down. Monte continued along the path. He walked parallel to the Chukwatanchi Creek between the food plot and the water. He didn't think anything of it, but he was walking into a dangerous situation. Just ahead of him was another family of wild pigs. They were just coming from the water, heading to the field to forage when Monte crossed paths with them. Suddenly, there was a rush towards the 70-year-old. He just looked over his shoulder to see a flash of brown before being thrown through the air. He landed heavily on the ground, his rifle 5 feet away, unable to move for a second. He was dazed, borderline knocked out. He was stunned for a moment, trying to make sense of the situation. As he lay there on the cold, wet mud, he could feel his shoulder throbbing. He looked down at his hand. It was bleeding. There was a significant gash made by either a hoof or a tusk. Then he lifted his head and got the shock of his life. There, standing 4 feet from him, was an enormous wild pig. It was staring at him, its eyes unblinking. Monte couldn't believe its size. He guessed it was around 300 pounds, maybe even more. And he froze. He couldn't decide what the best option was in that situation. He was alone, unarmed, and in the middle of nowhere. He couldn't tell what the animal was thinking. There was nothing to give away whether it was curious, aggressive, or defensive. It just stared at him in complete silence. Monte made the biggest gamble of his life. All of a sudden, he threw his arms up above his head, yelled at the top of his voice, and lunged at the pig. The pig turned and bolted. The gamble had paid off. Monte let out a huge sigh and clambered to his feet. He wasn't sure just how much damage the wild pigs had done, but he knew he had been incredibly lucky. He knew that if that pig had charged at him when he was on the ground, then it would have been game over. He is certain of that. And that had been a hard thing for him to wrap his head around. Trying to come to terms with just how close he came to losing his life that night, Monte grabbed his rifle and stumbled along the path, back to his vehicle. He glanced back every few steps, terrified another was on its way. The adrenaline was wearing off now, and the pain began searing through his body. He required surgery on his shoulder and 7 months of therapy to overcome the damage caused by the pig. It's an experience the longtime hunter will never forget, and he will never make the same mistake again. Getting between a pig's water and food. Elsewhere, wild pigs have been threatening the lives of other Americans. James is as tough as they come. He is a highly experienced and successful animal trapper and remover in East Central Florida's Brevard County. But one particular encounter nearly cost him his life. When James got a call from a neighborhood about a troublesome wild pig, he knew just what to do. 26 years of trapping these animals, Dean had learned a thing or two. But this particular pig was threatening the lives of people living in the area. It had acted aggressively towards 2 small children and an elderly couple walking their dog. There was no doubt about it. This animal had to be relocated. James arrived on the scene and immediately set up one of his traps. Sure enough, as expected, the wild pig was caught within 24 hours. Now came the difficult part. James had to move the pig from the trapping crate to a transport crate. That would then be winched onto the back of his truck and driven away. This time was different, however. Something went horribly wrong. The pig wasn't that big. It was around 200 pounds. James brought his truck up to the pig and lowered the transport crate down in front of the other one. Now, it was simply a matter of lifting the doors of both crates and ushering the pig from one to the other. This had worked for the past 26 years, but at that precise moment, two young girls burst out of their front door to see what was going on. They squealed and ran towards the trapper. This startled the pig, who began to buck and lurch inside the crates. Its raw power moved the two crates apart, and it began to squeeze its snout through the gap between the two. James could see what was going to happen. This wild pig was going to launch an attack on the two girls. He couldn't let that happen. He had no other alternative. He dived on top of the pig just as it squeezed its way out of the crates. It went mad and squealed and bucked and ripped its head this way and that when it felt James on top of it. James wrestled with it. He couldn't tell what damage it was doing to him. All he could think about was getting it back into the crates. Somehow, with all his strength, he managed to push it back into the crates and slide the door shut. But he was gravely injured. In the commotion, the wild pig had torn through both of James's calf muscles, sliced through one kneecap, exposed bone, chewed chunks of flesh out of his arms, cracked into his head and cut into his feet, through his steel toe-capped boots. James needed urgent medical care. He crawled across the ground to get into his truck to drive to hospital, but when he pulled himself into the driver's seat, he collapsed, and everything went black. But James was not alone. The incident had been witnessed by one local who immediately called the sheriff's department and emergency services. James's family were alerted and rushed to the scene, arriving just before the ambulance. His son, Christian, pulled him from the truck and tied a tourniquet to stem some of the bleeding. Moments later, the paramedics arrived. It was touch and go whether he would make it or not. Luckily, the rapid response of the rescue team meant that James lived to trap another day. He underwent 3 surgeries and fought off multiple infections, but survived the most brutal attack he has ever encountered. Most of the damage was done by the pig's tusks. They just tore through skin and flesh like a knife through butter. The attack has made James more devoted to protecting children and locals against wild animals, and he has tried to educate people about the dangers surrounding America's wild pigs. He believes that it's just a matter of time before someone is killed by a wild pig in one of America's suburbs.